I'm delighted to be back at Beit Avichai for this series of 4 talks on different Jewish and Christian understandings of the Bible. These talks are based on a book that I published in 2020 with the New Testament scholar Amy Jill Levine. The title of the book is The Bible with and Without Jesus, and its subtitle is How Jews and Christians Understand the Same Stories Differently. And in these 4 sessions, we'll be looking at various sets of stories and talking about these different understandings. The most important word in the title of the book is "and." The Bible with the Bible with and without Jesus. At some point, when we got proofs for the book back from the publisher, they accidentally changed the title to The Bible with or Without Jesus, and we had a fit, because the whole point of the book is to talk about to talk about mutual understanding and respect, and to talk about how the 2 different communities could each, in legitimate ways, understand the Bible differently. But before we get to a variety of texts that I will be looking at, and I'll be talking about texts from the book of Genesis, Sefer Bereshit this morning, some preliminaries concerning the Bible, different understandings of the Bible in each of the communities. It is crucial to realize that when Jews and Christians talk about the Bible, they're not really talking about the same text. The Bible means fundamentally different things within these different communities, and indeed, different terms are used within these communities. So, as a Jew, when I talk about the Bible for myself, I'm talking about the Bible, the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. Those are the terms that I will typically use. And within the Jewish count, these are 24 books that you have. These are identical to the 39 books that are used in the Protestant count for the Bible. This is because certain books that count for 1 in the Jewish count, such as the book of Samuel or the book of Chronicles, count for 2 in the Christian count. And in addition, the 12 minor prophets count as a single book in the Jewish count, but count as 12 different books in the Christian count. So thus you have this really odd thing that 24 books, Jewishly, are identical to 39 books within the Protestant tradition. And indeed, the Catholic tradition has additional books, often called Apocrypha. So 24 equal 39 equal 46. We're indeed talking about the very same books. But for Christians, the issue when you talk about the Bible is you're not only talking about the Old Testament, to use the Christian term, or the Hebrew or the Jewish Bible or the Tanakh, to use the Jewish term, but we're talking about the Hebrew Bible plus the New Testament. So thus, the Bible, what I would refer to as a Jew, is only part of the larger Christian Bible. Just since some of you may not be so aware of the structure of the New Testament, let me spend a few minutes on that. The New Testament has 4 main parts. The first section, which is certainly the best known, are the Gospels. 4 primary Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are not in chronological order. New Testament scholars would agree that Mark is the earliest of the 4 Gospels. The first 3 of these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are related to each other closely in a variety of ways, and they're often called the Synoptic Gospels. John is separate, although some recent scholars have suggested otherwise. Until recently, scholars have believed that John really is separate and did not know the 3 synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These present themselves as eyewitness accounts of the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. The scholarly opinion is that they were written after the death of Jesus. That is followed by a single book, the book of Acts, which is understood to be a continuation of the Gospel of Luke about the early history of the church. A very large and very difficult section of the New Testament is a section that is comprised of letters or epistles. These are, in the main, attributed to the very central early Christian figure, Paul. According to some scholars, some of these are authentic to Paul. Some of these were only secondarily attributed to Paul. Some are not connected to Paul at all. But these are letters which, even though they are in the third part of the New Testament, are actually earlier in terms of their composition. At least the authentic letters of Paul are earlier in their composition than the Gospels themselves. The last section of the New Testament is the book of Revelation. Please note, it is called the book of Revelation without an S at the end. Many Jews who read this book for the first time find it to be a very unusual book. It is part of a genre called apocalyptic literature. In that sense, it is continuous with a book that exists in the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, Old Testament, namely the book of Daniel, which is apocalyptic as well, very unusual descriptions of what is going to happen in the future time. The canons of the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament are not identical. And indeed, as you can see from this slide, the canons of the Protestant Old Testament and the Catholic and Greek Orthodox Old Testament are not identical either. So thus, it is important to realize that even though the Protestant and the Jewish Old Testament Hebrew Bible have the same books, they are indeed different. They are ordered differently. They are grouped differently. So, for example, the reason that the Hebrew Bible is called the Tanakh within Judaism is that it has three sections: Torah, or the Pentateuch, Nevi'im, prophets, which is divided Jewishly into two different sections, former prophets and latter prophets, and Ketuvim, literally writings, a section of miscellaneous works, including, for example, the book of Psalms. The Christian canon of the Old Testament, however, is divided into four sections. First, you have the Torah, or the Pentateuch. Then you have books about the past, historical books. Then you have books about the present, namely poetic and wisdom books. And finally, you have prophetic books. Thus, I remember from my youth once watching Jeopardy, where the question was, what is the last book of the Old Testament? As a Jew, I naturally said that the last book of the Old Testament was the last book of Ketuvim, namely the book of Chronicles. The answer would have been declared wrong. The last book of the Old Testament from the Protestant and Catholic perspective is the book of Malachi. Please also note the books are in different orders, and within the Catholic and Orthodox canon, there are certain additional books, as I said a few moments ago. And I remind you, order of books matters, and the whether or not certain books are within the canon matter a lot. So even when people are talking about the Christian versus the Jewish Old Testament, there really are significant differences as well that we will need to take into consideration in all four of these sessions. Context is one of the most important words that I'm going to talk about in these four lectures. And thus, when, for example, I talk about the book of Psalms within the Bible, I really need to be talking about the book of Psalms in different contexts in each of these cases. When I talk about Psalms within the Hebrew Bible, it is one of 24 books. When I talk about the book of Psalms within the Christian Bible, then I'm talking about the place of the book of Psalms within both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that makes a huge difference. Furthermore, when I talk about context within the Jewish and Christian Bible, it is important to remember that within Christianity, essentially the entire Bible is talking about the life, death, and especially the resurrection of Jesus, while within Judaism, certainly the Bible does not have a single center or theme, and that will be of relevance as we understand differences of interpretation in these two texts. Thus, what I'm going to be doing throughout this lecture series is talking about three possible contexts for reading the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. I am not going to say that any one of these contexts is correct. These are each legitimate contexts, and furthermore, I would note that there are many other possible contexts beyond these three. But the three that I'm going to be emphasizing are, number one, what did the Bible originally mean as an ancient Israelite text? An ancient Israelite text taking into consideration that ancient Israel was part of the ancient Near Eastern world. I will also be talking about the meaning of biblical texts within the larger Christian Bible, and I will be talking about the meaning of the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh within Jewish tradition, thus looking at rabbinic tradition and looking at post-rabbinic Jewish medieval tradition as well. A final issue that is important for understanding the three different perspectives that I'm going to be talking about is the language that the Bible is written in. Within Judaism, the Bible is important in Hebrew, and again, I'll say a small number of sections of the Hebrew Bible are in Aramaic, as odd as that sounds. Christians, until the Reformation, until Luther, were typically not reading the Bible in Hebrew, but were initially reading the Bible in Greek, whether we're talking about the Old Testament as translated into Greek, a translation known as the Septuagint that I'm going to mention quite a few times during this series. And at some point, when Christians were not predominantly speaking Greek, they were speaking Latin, the most important translation for Christians was the Vulgate, created by Jerome. Jerome lived from the 340s until 420, and that was the central Bible for the Christian community. Thus, even if the different communities have the same texts, let us say the book of Psalms or the book of Isaiah, both of which I'll be talking about, they may be reading different words because the Hebrew original, the Greek translation, and I remind you that the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible was done by Jews. So this is a Jewish translation, and Jerome's Vulgate. Those three may not have exactly the same text. We're now finally ready to dig into the Hebrew Bible itself, and I'm going to start at the very beginning, which indeed starts with the words, in the beginning, or when God began to create. And here I'm going to offer four different translations of the verse, which I am first going to read in Hebrew. The words that are most important for this particular section of the lecture are highlighted in green. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. V'aretz hayta tohu vavohu, v'choshech al pnei tehom. And these are the two key words. V'ruach Elohim mirachefet al pnei hamayim. I'll begin with what I as a Jew use as my standard translation when I talk about translations, the New Jewish Publication Society translation from the second part of the 20th century. Each of the three sections of the Tanakh had a different group of translators. When God began to create, and I know very well some of you may be used to a different translation, in the beginning God created, you could see that in the second and the third translations. I'm not going to discuss that difference in this particular lecture, but when God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, wonderful Hebrew words, tohu vavohu, with darkness over the face of the deep, and here is what I care about. And a wind from God sweeping over the water. Now, I left some of the footnote numbers or letters from translations in these particular slides. Those usually indicate that there are differences in the translation. And indeed, when I come to the King James Version, what has become the standard Protestant version, completed in the year 1611, there you see that Ruach Elohim, the NJPS, a wind from God, is translated as the Spirit with a capital S of God. And that same thing is true in the Catholic translation, the Douay-Rheims translation, the Spirit of God. On the other hand, the newest Protestant translation, the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, that's quite a mouthful, completed just several years ago, has that phrase as a wind from God, even though it notes that there are alternative translations as well. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about this phrase comprised of two words, Ruach, wind or spirit, Elohim, God, or perhaps other translations as well. I'm going to start with the standard biblical lexicon, Brown, Driver, Briggs, BDB, which translates the word ruach as breath, wind, and spirit. And one of the ways that we know, in fact, I would argue the main way we know what words mean, is looking at various contexts where they appear. So here, let me show you, and again, the word ruach is always going to be in green in these slides, certain places where the word ruach means. Each of these will illustrate, I hope beyond a doubt, that breath, wind, and spirit are legitimate translations of the word ruach based on the context. The first two verses are going to be from Breshit, from Genesis, from the account of the biblical flood, where there you have Kol asher nishmat ruach chayim be'apav, all in whose nostrils were the merest breath of life. So here you see that the word ruach can clearly mean breath. The second use of the word, one chapter later, is toward the end of the flood narrative, and I'm only going to read the second part of the verse. Vaya'aver Elohim ruach al haaretz, where in the translation, God caused a wind to blow across the earth. Here, quite unambiguously, we were talking about a wind, something that blows, a phenomenon of nature. A third usage, and again, all of these usages are relatively common. This usage is found at the beginning of the book of 2 Kings, when you have a transition from Elijah, Eliyahu, to Elisha, Elisha, as a central prophet. And I'm only going to read the section that you have in English in the quotation marks, but I'll just start with the Hebrew so you could again hear the word ruach. Vayomru, the prophetic disciples said, Nacha ruach Eliyahu al Elisha. They exclaimed, I'm in the JPS translation, the spirit of Elijah has settled on Elisha. So here you see this refers to the prophetic spirit which is within an individual, which allows him or her to perceive and to recite the divine word, in other words, to be a prophet. And here you see that the word ruach is used for that spirit as well. And I would just note that the Greek term pneuma, you might know this term from English as well, people who have pneumonia, for example, it has exactly the same semantic range or senses as the Hebrew word ruach. In other words, it could mean a breath, it could mean a spirit, or it could be the physical wind as well. Now let's go to the second word in the phrase Ruach Elohim. This is the standard way of referring to God in the Bible. I will not adduce any examples for that. But it also has a second use. I need to be grammatical for a second. So for example, in English, we have forms which are called superlatives. So something can be large, which is the regular form, larger, the comparative form, or largest, ending in an est. That is how you form superlatives in English. Hebrew has no single form like est with which to express something that is the greatest, and has several different ways of expressing superlatives. One way of expressing superlatives is using one of the words for God in a particular phrase. So for example, in the book of Jonah, which I'll talk about quite extensively in the 4th lecture, when the author wants to say that the city of Nineveh is a very, very large city, it says, I'll first read the Hebrew, V'Nineveh hayata ir gdola le'Elohim. Nineveh was literally a large city of God, which means Nineveh was an extremely large city, or as they translate it, Nineveh was an enormously large city. And thus, having the word Elohim at the end of a phrase can be a way of expressing a superlative, and thus the phrase Ruach Elohim could also mean an extreme sort of ruach, a great wind, perhaps, a mighty wind, is perfectly a legitimate translation as well. So let me begin to bring this together. If you are Christian, and you see this in the King James Version and the Dewey-Reams Version, you are likely to translate the word ruach from Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, as spirit with a capital S. And indeed, spirit is part of the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And indeed, the early church figures, often called early church fathers, Augustine and Jerome, are unambiguous that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, Ruach Elohim needs to be understood as the Holy Spirit, and thus the Holy Trinity, including Jesus, is already in the Bible from its very second verse. If you are Jewish, this very same phrase is going to be understood differently. It is typically not understood as spirit, either with a capital or lowercase n at the beginning, but will be understood as a great wind, or a wind of God, or perhaps, according to some, spirit with a lowercase s. Thus, for example, in one of the interpretations he gives of this verse, Rashi, the great Jewish commentator who lived in Provence in France, lived from the year 1040 to 1105, brings a rabbinic interpretation or midrash that Ruach Elohim here refers to God's seat of glory. Another famous Jewish commentator, Rashbam, who was Rashi's grandson, understands Ruach Elohim quite prosaically as a wind from God. But what is most important in understanding these verses is that there's going to be a fundamental Jewish-Christian divide, where Christianity typically has understood this Ruach as referring to part of the Trinity, and Judaism, without a Trinity, is never going to understand it this way. This same issue of the presence of the Trinity in Genesis chapter 1, in what biblical scholars call the first creation story, or the priestly creation story, is going to reappear later in the chapter in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Again, let me start with the Hebrew. Vayomer Elohim, Naseh Adam b'tzelmenu kidmutenu. And here I'll read the New Jewish Publication Society translation. The New Revised Standard Version is quite similar, although I'll make a slight change reflecting the gender neutral nature of the original Hebrew text. And God said, "Let us make human, or a human, in our image, after our likeness." Now the Hebrew is quite clear. You 3 times have an indication that we are talking about a plural here. You have na'aseh, let us make. You have the suffix in b'tzelmenu, in our image, and you have the suffix in kidmutenu, after our likeness. And thus, it is quite clear that you have a plural here. Now, coming back to Rashi, here I'm going to read the English translation of Rashi. This was a well-known issue, and Rashi, living in a Christian world in France, certainly knew about the Christian understandings of this. And Rashi says, first typically quoting the biblical text, "We will, or let us make man." Although they will be explained in a second, did not assist him, note the capital H God, in forming the man, and although this use in the plural may give the heretics, and here this is a term which is used in rabbinic and in medieval literature for Christians, though not only for Christians, an occasion to rebel, in other words, to argue in favor of the Trinity, yet this verse does not refrain from teaching proper conduct and the virtue of humbleness, namely, that the greater should consult and take permission from the smaller. Let me stop reading here for a second. What Rashi is saying, following traditional rabbinic understanding, is that this plural refers to the fact that God consulted with the angels before creating people, because after all, in Psalm 8 it says about people, "V'techasrehu me'at me'Elohim." The people, humans, are just a little bit less than the divine. And since they're so similar to angels, God needed to consult them. And thus, this plural, "we will make man," according to the traditional rabbinic interpretation adduced here by Rashi, means that God consulted with the angels. I now continue with the text of Rashi. "For had it been written, 'I shall make man,' we would not then have learned that he spoke to his judicial council, namely the angels, but to himself." Stop here for a second. Rashi is acutely aware of the fact that this could be seen as fostering belief in a multiplicity of deity or the Trinity, and therefore Rashi, following the rabbinic midrash Bereshit Rabbah, Genesis Rabbah, continues. And as a refutation of the heretics, the following verse says, "Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam, b'tzelem Elohim bara oto, zacharu nekeva bara otam." The beginning of that is, "And God in the singular created the man, and it is not written, and they created." In other words, the following verse makes it clear that even though verse 26 may talk in the plural, it is ultimately a single deity and not the Trinity who is being referred to here. And thus you have an anti-Christian polemic, which I emphasize in bold, and this is going to be a theme of all of these presentations. This should not be a model for us and what we do. And indeed, if you want to see this from the other side, you have the early church figure, Tertullian. Many of the early church figures were living in northern Africa. He's from the 2nd century of the Common Era. He explains very clearly, nay, it was because God had already his Son close to his side as a second person, namely the second part of the Trinity, his own word, and a third person also, the Spirit in the Word, that he purposely adopted the plural phrase, let us make and in our image and become as one of us. Thus, the Christian interpretation is going to emphasize the plurality of us that you have in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, where the Jewish interpretation is going to emphasize the singular Vayivra, he created in Genesis chapter 27. I ask as an open question, how are we to know which verse is really the most important? I now move on to what scholars call the second creation story. That story begins in the middle of Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. Perhaps I'll have some other opportunity for discussing why scholars believe there are two creation stories, but this is a broad scholarly consensus. And here, I would just like to point out a difference. Really, it might seem quite trivial, but I think it's quite important between Jewish Bibles in the Hebrew and English Bible translations. Most English Bible translations add various titles and subtitles, which are not found in the original Hebrew text. And these are important because they frame the way in which we as readers are going to understand the text. And thus, for now, I ask as an open question, what should we call the text that starts with or contains the creation of Adam and Eve? I remind all of you that in Genesis chapter 1, the words or the names Adam and Eve are totally absent, and you simply have Ha-Adam, the man, the person. It is not a name or a personal noun there. It is person or people in general. The story that starts in Genesis 2:4b, the second part of 4, can go by a variety of different titles. It can be called quite neutrally, and this can work very, very well for both the Jewish and the Christian tradition. Call it the garden story or the Garden of Eden story. Alternatively, it can be called the fall of man or the fall of humanity story. Alternatively, and certainly that second option is going to be a Christian option. Thirdly, it could be called the origin of original sin. Or if we want to play with that third option, which is a Christian option, another way of reading this story, which is really turning it on its head, is to call it, instead of original sin, original opportunity. Again, each of these four names is legitimate. They have very different ways of framing the story. And right now, I'm simply not going to give it any title, but I'm going to look a little bit at the story itself. I first want to make an important observation about the story within the larger Hebrew Bible. And that general observation is that there are certain stories or laws that are very important within the Hebrew Bible, and you see them repeated time after time again. So, for example, the story of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is repeated quite a few times within the Hebrew Bible, and it is used as a type of paradigm for terrible evil which results in destruction. You might think that the story of the Garden of Eden is such an important story that it is repeated throughout the Tanakh or the Old Testament, but that is not the case. You have several ambiguous references to the garden elsewhere outside of Genesis 2 and 3, but the basic storyline that you have concerning the garden, the eating of the fruits, and the expulsion of the garden is never repeated again in the Hebrew Bible. Furthermore, it is clear, unambiguous, that the name of Eve, Hebrew Chava, never appears again as part of a story, a retelling of this elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. And it is ambiguous, it is unclear whether the name Adam, is mentioned again elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. And the reason this is ambiguous, because Hebrew does not differentiate between capital and lowercase letters. And thus, when you have the word Adam in Hebrew in the original Bible, you do not know if it is referring to Adam or if it is referring to person or a person in general. And thus, I can say with certainty that if Adam does appear again in the Hebrew Bible, it is fewer than 3 cases. Stated differently, the story of the garden with Adam and Eve is not important elsewhere within the Tanakh. But let's contrast the New Testament. In one of the most important letters of Paul, written to the community in Corinth, and thus called Paul's second letter to the Corinthians or to Corinthians, Paul says, I quote, "But I am afraid that, as the serpent deceived Eve by its cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ." A very clear and explicit reference to the garden story in this epistle of Paul. The most important place for Christian tradition where you have a mention of the garden story is in Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 5. I'm going to read to you a quote, which is going to be from this slide and next slide. This is a very difficult quote to follow. The rhetoric of Paul in Romans is very sophisticated and is very difficult. But first, I need to give a bit of introduction before I read this particular quote. There is a phrase in literary study which is called typology, which means that a particular text is based on an earlier text. So, for example, in New Testament studies, scholars have pointed out, and this is very clear, that Jesus is a type of Moses. He is based on Moses. So, for example, Moses has a significant revelation on Mount Sinai. Jesus offers a significant sermon on the Mount. Moses fasts on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. Jesus fasts for 40 days and 40 nights according to the Gospels. And I could offer many examples in which certain attributes are attributed to Jesus that are taken from Moses. It is also possible to talk about Jesus as a type of Elijah as well. But again, my central point is, and you have this in rabbinic literature as well, that a later figure can be modeled after an earlier figure, and thus that later figure is a type of that earlier figure. In the same way that B can be a type of A, B could have many features in common with A, but these features can be reversed. That is called an antitype within literary studies. And thus, in Romans chapter 5, Jesus is depicted as an antitype of the first person of Adam. Jesus is a type of new creation, beginning a new world order, but in his attributes is the reverse of Adam. With this introduction, I hope this short section from Romans chapter 5 will make some sense. Paul is speaking. Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, namely Adam, and death through sin, because eating from the fruit caused death. And so death spread to all because all have sinned. For sin was indeed in the world before the law, before the giving of the Torah. But sin is not reckoned when there is no law. In other words, how can you think about a sin before law? Yet, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who did not sin in the likeness of Adam. In other words, there was death in the world as a result of eating from the fruit, even of people, perhaps Moses, who did not sin in a significant way. And it continues in the likeness of Adam, who is a pattern or a type of the one who was to come. Adam is a pattern of Jesus. How is this so? But the free gift, namely the belief and the benefits in Jesus as the resurrected Messiah, is not like the trespass, the original sin of Adam. For if the many died through the one man's trespass, this word in Greek can also be translated as fall, much more surely have the grace of God and the gift and the grace of the one man, Jesus, abounded for the many. Jesus' grace is the opposite of the sin of Adam. And the gift is not like the effect of one man's sins. For the judgment following one man's trespass brought condemnation, but the gift following many trespasses brings justification. In other words, the gift of Jesus is going to fundamentally bring forgiveness. And this text continues talking about and contrasting one man's trespass, namely Adam, with the gift of righteousness. You could see the end of verse 17 through Jesus. And the fundamental point is Jesus is a new type, a reversal of what you have in Adam. This difficult text becomes the foundation for two central notions in early Christian doctrine, two central notions that are different from one another, namely original sin and the fall of man. And these ideas, again, are not identical. They may be implicit in the New Testament text, but they're not explicit within it. The idea of original sin, seen in the early church father Augustine, who also was North African, he lived from 354 to 430. Augustine says, the inherited guilt of the first sin is such that by it the human race is made a debtor to divine justice. And he continues, for since all were in that one man, in other words, we were all in Adam, when he sinned, all were together in the one, and all were brought into the state of condemnation. In other words, all future generations were in Adam. We are all Adam's descendants, and as such, he sinned, and we have, in the most fundamental way, inherited that sin of Adam. That is the meaning of original sin, a sin or guilt inherited by all people from Adam. Augustine also popularized the idea of the fall of man, which means Adam's fall from an original state of grace. And I remind you, we saw this in the ambiguous translation of Romans chapter 5, verse 15, where through one man's trespass can also be translated as through one man's fall. And these notions are of fundamental importance to Christian doctrine from the very earliest forms of post-New Testament Christianity. But I would point out that the notion of original sin, although it is not found within Judaism, does have some reverberation in Jewish texts. So, for example, Psalm 51 says, "Indeed, I was born with iniquity, with sin my mother conceived me." And this notion that people are fundamentally problematic is found in other texts in the Tanakh as well. But in none of these Jewish cases is there a direct connection to the Eden story. I return to names. Is this a neutral story, a garden story? Is this, from a Christian perspective, a story about the fall of man or the fall of humanity or original sin, which all people still live with? Or, as in some Jewish readings, is it not so ideal to be in Eden? Is the discovery of sexual desire, which is what that second story is about, and getting out of Eden, something positive? Is this a type of opening of Pandora's box? And therefore, is this a story of original opportunity? Same words, different interpretations. So to bring this together, when we talk about the Bible or the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, here are three initial things to keep in mind. The Bible is not identical for all of these communities. Indeed, different Bibles, Jewish versus Christian, Protestant versus Catholic, have different texts, have different words, are in different languages. Secondly, often the same words are interpreted differently depending on their context. In this case, their religious context. Is Ruach Elohim the Spirit of God, who is part of the Trinity, with Spirit as a capital S? Or is it, in the predominant Jewish translation, a wind of God or a great wind? And please note, what I would like to emphasize in all of these lectures is that we must appreciate why different communities understand these same words differently. And I would like to suggest that it is possible to be deeply committed to your own tradition, whether this is a religious or scholarly tradition, while at the same time understanding and appreciating other contexts, which give rise to different interpretations, and being respectful of those other traditions and interpretations. Thank you very much. We will continue and see these 3 points in our next lecture, which will deal with Psalm 22.